Society, we talk about the rise of podcasts and how they influence how we broadcast. Hello and welcome to Media and Society. I'm your host, Alicia Nhlanhla Jali. Now, this is a show where we take a look at the intersection between the media as well as you, the society. Now, this show would not be complete without your input, so do give us a call on 011 714 0661, alternatively 714 0662, or X us using the hashtag SABC Media Society. Now, over the past few years, there has been an extraordinary rise in the global appeal of podcasts. Now, these digital audio programs have significantly impacted the media scene, transforming how we engage with content as well as captivating audience on a global scale. Now, whether you find yourself on your daily commute, hitting the gym, or just unwinding at home, podcasts provide a very convenient as well as engaging avenue for entertainment, education, and storytelling. Joining us to discuss this is Mr. Leroy Mack, who is a radio as well as TV personality, entrepreneur, as well as an attorney. We're expecting Thabang Sekaja, who is the co-host and producer of the Dojo podcast. We do have Mr. Lebo Lion, digital as well as new media marketer and host of the Lebo Lion show. He is joining us via Teams, as well as back in studio, Elton, who is the Black Elton, who's the host of Something's Got to Change, as well as Mr. Penson Mlodwa, who is a media broker as well as a podcaster. Gentlemen, a very good morning to each and every one of you, looking so handsome. How are you doing this morning?
Very, very good. You're doing good.
Are you well?
Great, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing very, very well. So, gentlemen, let's start with you in studio. Look, are you able to basically provide a brief overview of what podcasting, for those who may not know the kind of space that we're talking about, can we classify it as part of social media broadcasting, Leroy?
I think so. I think because it's not on terrestrial above the line media, you can call it part of social media. You know, it used to live primarily on the YouTube space where you pre-record something, you put it up there, and now we can even go live and you can interact with people on there. Even the social media platforms that exist, the Instagrams, the Twitters, the X's, whatever, they have a live streaming element, so it allows you to podcast even when you're on those platforms. So it really is sort of the next frontier of content creation, being long form without the need to have advertisers in between the segments as we do with terrestrial television, you know, not having to subscribe to regulators like ICASA or whatever you have in your jurisdiction. So it really is the sort of unfettered, unrestricted level of broadcasting that sits quite squarely in that social media place.
Now, Elton, how would you characterize, podcasting? You are currently in the space, and maybe talk to us about how you actually got into the industry.
Okay, so basically when you look at my background, I'm a person that's coming from, typical corporates. I did an actuarial science degree, the numbers are
Very
some things
smart.
that thank you. So now I'm actually transitioning into the media space, right? And I got the opportunity to work on Something's Got to Change, which is a podcast that I'm one of the panelists on. And, when you look at podcasting, it actually opens a lot of doors for people, who don't necessarily have that formal education of film and television or radio. So for example, with me coming from a corporate background, I'm able to get into the industry through podcasting. So it's actually breaking those barriers that we have within the media industry. And those are some of the topics that we actually discuss on Something's Got to Change, because we're looking at what is it that has to change within the media industry, and what can we do as people within the media industry. But what I like about podcasting is the fact that when you look at it, it's very easy, like Leroy said, the barriers are not as much as
there's not much
you
red
can
tape,
literally do it with your smartphone, and you just get a mic and then you sort it, you're good to go, and you're able to change your opinions, and now we actually have a plethora of opinions and content that you can choose from. So we're not necessarily limited, and that's what I love about podcasting.
And Penson, talk to us about how you also broke into this industry. We know there's a lot of cancel culture within the media industry. So I suppose podcasting or social media broadcasting is a sort of way where you can actually just diverse instead of going the traditional media route.
Yeah, so I think for me, as an opinionated somebody, coming from a family that's quite opinionated, so we've got an educational background as teachers.
Very opinionated.
And very opinionated. So the migration going from that space to blogging, from blogging, then to vlogging, from vlogging to the vodcast, or what people call the podcast, has been quite a journey. And I think, as Amachita had already said, it's a courtyard where we can have our opinions. Yes, there is red tape, so Leroy touched about a YouTube. You say the wrong thing, talk about the wrong subject, cancel culture. You get demonetized, so it's not as intense as it is in the traditional sense, as the above line media, but you can start seeing there is a bit of a shift, with how it's being managed and how it's being controlled, even though it is social media, even though there is a level of being the Wild West, but we have to tread carefully with today's cancel culture and how the internet never forgets.
No, it doesn't.
Very interesting point there. Tabang, how have you, navigated your spot, so to say, in the industry or in the podcasting world?
I'm glad you used the word industry, because I think that is what it is morphing to become. So with my background on the Dojo podcast, I actually also came from a corporate background. So I did not set out to start a podcast. So what has actually happened is I had been looking at this particular podcast that I eventually became a part of from the eyes of a marketer. So I was engaging the particular guys that started the podcast, which is Maurice Tasanyani and Tebelo Mufukeng. So my understanding was that as part of the media landscape, I knew that consumer preferences were changing in terms of how they consume the media. And I looked at podcasting as one of those avenues where you can be able to pilot and start certain things with audiences, which I think that's the opportunity from the marketing and media corporate side that the platform allows corporates to be able to do. Just away from just the production of it, just the business and the corporate value of it. So coming into the podcast, I was able to then, my contribution to be more on a corporate side, to be able to say, how are we set up to be able to take advantage of partnering with brands and also morphing it into a fully fledged business that would ultimately have similar structures as your traditional media.
Penson, I want to ask you, what do you think constitutes a consumable podcast content?
So, Mina, my problem that I have with today's time, especially when you talk about podcasts, is the site or the alignment with brands. The moment you align with brands and open yourself up for some level of version of control.
True.
So currently I work in the media space, so I'm behind the curtain and now I'm in front of the camera at the same time, and are we slowly but surely converting this Wild West, this open playing field into being the traditional media? Because traditional media was always governed by advertising rands, by whoever is controlling the purse strings. And if we're going to slowly migrate into a space where all these places that were meant for free, open discussion and debate, all of a sudden we open it up to brands, what will then happen? Will this podcast space then just become a different version of the traditional media, or watching it on a different platform? So I think right now that's where I'm at when they talk about marketing and this new podcast landscape. I think we need to tread very, very lightly of what we're trying to achieve in this one arena versus what has been there. It shouldn't be a mirror of what was there. It should just be a different space where different voices that haven't been heard before have an opportunity to not being governed, being tailored, being managed. So that's just my view. I don't know if I've answered your question correctly.
No. We're getting there. Leroy, maybe just to clarify on the red tape that they're talking about when brands start to align themselves with a particular podcast or an anchor or a presenter. Talk to us about what then causes the red tape. What are some of the regulations that are stipulated upon, of course, the brand or the show that is taken over by the brand?
Well, I think we need to differentiate very quickly between things like podcasts and content creation, because the whole idea around content creation is that brands will then utilize your audience, whatever field you're in, to be able to get their message across, and it's monetized, whether you get paid up front or you get paid in some sort of incentive. And that's why we have that paid partnership tag that you have usually on things. So that's where the red tape begins, in my opinion, where as far as content creation is concerned. And it might seem like very similar products, but I think it's very different. As you say, podcasting is where we're able to digest an issue and really get into a conversation without having to worry about, first of all, language, second of all, some of the sort of taboo subjects like sex, like politics, like religion. So that's the one part of it. The red tape comes in because obviously, because you're broadcasting online and you have an audience. Right now there's congressional hearings happening in the US where the big CEOs of all the social media platforms, everywhere from Discourse to Snapchat to X to Meta, are having to answer for their crimes along sexual grooming of children and access to predators who have access to children. And the red tape comes in from a legal point of view because there are also other segments that you're including in your podcast that are protected. If we talk about things like trademarks and copyright, that's one of the sort of the baselines we need to chat about how you may be able to interrogate a subject by playing a song, by having a piece of work displayed, by interrogating it, and you might be infringing on a copyright. You might be infringing on a trademark. So that's one element of it from a legal point of view, but also things like defamation, libel, slander. Those are things we need to be very, very aware of, that as much as you have a podcast that has a freedom of speech that's laid on top of it, are you being slanderous? Are you being libelous? Are you being defamatory? And for me, those are the red tape. Now, the red tape with advertising is a different field altogether, because once you start interacting with brands, as you say, you need to stand up to the Advertising Standards Authority. So there's certain things you're not allowed to do. So for instance, on a platform like Instagram, when you're advertising alcohol, there must be a minimum restriction on age, on geographics.
A lot of disclaimers.
A lot of disclaimers. You must say it's a paid partnership, because had it not been for the money, you would not have this opinion.
True.
So the red tape comes in where the industry, I think, is self-regulating. We're getting to a point where we want to almost find our own policies that are good. But again, I think that's for content creation. I don't think that necessarily should be in the podcast space, because the podcast space is really about, again, breaking the fourth wall of media, where you're able to say what you think within reason, and we're able to discuss issues that we can't do on traditional media, because again, whether we want to or not, channels and media houses are owned by people, by brands, and you can't come on a platform and say, I hate brand A when they're part of the shareholding. So the red tape, I think, is one in the policy that the industry is self-regulating to get to a point, but there are definite legal red tape that we have to go through, which I've just mentioned. But I think, again, there has to be some sort of a differentiation between podcasting, where it is about breaking the fourth wall, and advertising through your content creation to get access to your audience.
Maybe Alton, add to that, and also maybe talk to us about what you think, what are some of the factors that have contributed to the unprecedented surge in the popularity of podcasts that we've seen in the recent years.
Okay, so I think when you look at podcasting, right, it's like an open field. Everything is possible. So now all you need is a smartphone and a mic, and then you're good to go. Then you can just, like, whatever topic that you feel like you relate with, then you can share it. And there's always a market for every topic, if you think about it. So you have your mental health, you have your sex, you have media-related podcasts. So everyone.
So you basically have to have a target market when you establishing the podcast.
And the good thing is that it's not very restricted. There's always going to be a target market for that specific niche that you're focusing on. And that is why we're seeing this emergence of podcasting, and also because it's relatively cheaper in comparison to the traditional media space. You know, if I have to start a radio station, that could take me years. But if I want to start a podcast, I can actually start next week. So those are the things that people need to consider. But I think other things that we also need to consider have to do with research, right, on the topics that we're discussing. I do feel like some podcasts, they don't really have people that research.
I was about to say, Elton.
So the opinions that they're sharing are a bit worrying, because people are now, you know, spewing homophobia, transphobia, you know, things that
misinformation, disinformation.
Misinformation.
But that's the risk you run, right? Because if you're going to monetize any platform and you say to me, I mean, the number of eyeballs that I see that see my content equal to me having some sort of remuneration, I'm going to be as wild as possible, because the space itself allows it to be that way. And that's why I make the differentiation, Elton, between content creation, where you're trying to get as many eyeballs on, to what you're saying about having a conversation that we can be very in-depth in and speak honestly and not worry about whether I'm offending brand X or Y.
So here's my thing, right? I think for me, I'm kind of privileged in the sense that I work with people that have been in traditional media. So you have your people that have worked on television and radio.
So you know about research and the importance thereof,
right? So the podcast, to you, it might seem like, okay, these people are just talking, but behind the scenes, there's a structure, there's research, there's fact-checking while we are on set as we're talking like this. There's someone who's going to say, Alton, I don't really think that's correct. Let me just correct you here. This is to prevent, you know, spreading misinformation. So I think also other podcasters need to maybe invest in research and also fact checking. You know, I'm not saying be boring and everything, but don't be spreading misinformation intentionally.
That's true. All right, let's also welcome now Lebo Lion, digital and new media marketer, as well as host of the Lebo Lion show. Lebo, thank you so much for joining us. So from you, we want to understand, for someone new to podcasts, how would you then describe the unique appeal as well as advantages, of course, that they offer over other forms of entertainment as well as information consumption? Lebo, please unmute. Lebo, we can't hear you. Please unmute. Welcome, Lebo. Go ahead.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, that's a great question. I think what people don't understand about media is that the reason why brands are so obsessed with this idea of the more eyeballs, the more money we give you, is because content is all about people. Right? So what new media has done is that it's broken that veil between the brand and the people, and it's allowed people to connect with the person who's producing that content. And so the value of a podcast or any other new media platform is actually its audience. It's not necessarily the podcast. And too many people are worried about the podcast, which is why they like to compare it to radio. And those are two very different things. Radio doesn't have the same access to the host. It doesn't have the same freedom of speech as you've spoken about. But also, there isn't as much room for the audience member to feel like they are also participating in the creation of that content. And that happens in podcasting. I think that's why it's so popular. And where we get it wrong, I think, from a brand perspective and a business perspective, is that we treat podcasting like radio. And so we think the value of podcasting is the platform instead of the people who are listening. And if we were more people-centric, we'd also be more content-centric and say, as a brand, we're looking for these kinds of people and they're interested in this kind of content, and this is what we're going to invest in from a long-term perspective, instead of pitting podcasters against each other as if they're different radio shows. And we want to just see who's got more numbers. So I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding where it comes to podcasting, and we don't actually understand where the value lies. And the value is in the people who listen, not in the platform.
Thank you for that. Tabang, I'm going to rope you in there, but I just need to, of course, go ahead to this now, where it is, of course, the last day of voter registration. We are crossing live to SABC News reporter Ntebo Mokobo, who's following developments there. We do understand that President Cyril Ramaphosa is currently encouraging voters, or those that are eligible to vote, to go and register. Ntebo, a very good morning to you. Has the president arrived? How is the voter registration drive going?
How are you? Good morning, and good morning to the viewers at home. Yes, the president has just arrived here at Mamelodi. He is going to get a briefing, and immediately after the briefing, then he would go on the street to interact with a number of potential voters who would be voting in the next upcoming elections. You would recall that, for the past 2 days, I would say, the president has been here in Gauteng interacting with people, and this, in fact, is very deliberate, as he said, that Gauteng is one of the most populous provinces in South Africa. 16 million people are residing here in Gauteng, and of course, around 25% of the population, or the voting population, is in this province. So he's been interacting with people, but now he's in Mamelodi, and the spokesperson for the ANC, the national spokesperson, Mahlenge Bhengu-Motsiri, is here with me. She's going to tell us why the choice of Gauteng.
Well, Gauteng is one of the provinces of South Africa. It is one of the most populous provinces in Debu, and it is also a province where you find a massive number of young people, young women, and people of all persuasions, culturally and linguistically. So it is a province that any party that is worth its election strategy should be focusing on, and that is what we are doing as the African National Congress. President is here. Yesterday he was in Soweto, warmly received. Today we are here in Tshwane, and we are also anticipating a very good reception for our president.
Sis Mahlenge, in 2019, the ANC got around 50.9%. That fell short of getting 50 plus 1. So it means the ANC didn't really get the exact majority, 50 plus 1. So it had to work with the ACDP and gave the ACDP some chair of a certain portfolio committee. How then are you sure that you're going to electrify the democratic electorate and ensure that people really look your way when election comes?
Well, I suppose that it is our campaign strategy that is going to, tell it all. I do want to say that we remain a majority party by any stretch in this country, as the governing party, as the incumbent government. We are working very hard to win the hearts and minds of our people. We are everywhere this entire weekend, everywhere, every single VD, wall to wall, east to west, south to north. You will see the ANC is the entire weekend. But the most important thing, the best way of winning an election is to go back to where you are strong at. And what the ANC has always been strong at is its groundwork.
If you look at the IEC records, around 14 million people who are eligible to vote, they didn't register. And 13 million of South Africans who are supposed to have voted in the previous elections didn't even care to vote. Is there any message that you will package that will then electrify this electoral?
Well, one of the things that we really want to emphasize is that today is not the last day to register to vote. There's online voter registration system. Young people, for example, that go to institutions of higher learning from tomorrow, there's going to be a lot of concerted effort by the ANC to go to campuses through our ANC Youth League and through the mother body itself and through the Progressive Youth Alliance, which is composed of the ANC Youth League, the Young Communist League, the Young Workers in Kusatu, and those within Sanko. Will be in campuses encouraging young people to vote. But over and above that, the fact that the online voter registration is still open does give us a window of hope, and we're going to be capitalizing on that. I can tell you that our strategy as the ANC is to make sure that our people utilize that window of opportunity.
Thanks, Sis Mahlenge. That's the ANC spokesperson, Mahlenge Bhengu-Motsiri, just explaining that the ANC president will be here, and of course he will interact with a number of voters at different voting districts. And you would recall that, really the ANC didn't perform well in the 2019 elections, and it didn't even get the 50 plus 1. It had to bank on the ACDP to give it a maximum 50 plus 1 to govern Gauteng. So it remains to be seen whether indeed the ANC will be on the ground and indeed and make sure that people vote for the ANC or vote for the governing party in their numbers. With that, is back to studio.
Thank you so much to SABC reporter there. That is Ndebo Mokobo, and he is at the final voter registration drive this weekend, where President Cyril Ramaphosa is currently in Mamelodi. Let's take a quick ad break, and of course, Media and Society will be back shortly after that. Stay with us. Welcome back. This is Media and Society. Now, armed with just a microphone and a computer, individuals driven by passion for specific subjects can easily become podcasters. Now, this democratization has resulted in a diverse range of voices as well as perspectives, creating a richer and more inclusive media landscape. And unlike in the past, where aspiring broadcasters face numerous entry barriers, podcasts have significantly lowered these obstacles, allowing for a more accessible as well as diverse representation of content creators. Joining us to discuss this, we still have Leroy Mark, who is a radio and TV personality, entrepreneur, as well as attorney. We have on Teams Mr. Thabang Sekaja, co-host and producer of the Dojo podcast, and Elton, the Black Elton, who is the host of Something's Got to Change, as well as Penson Mlodra, who is a media broker. We also have Lebu, of course, who is there, Lebu Lion, who's also joining us via Teams. So, Thabang, maybe let's just go back to you there. Maybe talk to us about how has the accessibility as well as ease of entry into the podcasting world contributed to its rapid rise in the past few years.
Of course, I think because of low barriers of entry, what you are seeing is that it does not take quite a lot of investment or resources to be able to create a product. Invariably, what that means is that there's going to be a lot of creation, a lot of product that add into the market or category. So the media landscape, by and large, will obviously grow as a pie, which will consist of legacy or traditional media, as well as the add-on of these new platforms. But I think what that does is that it means, from a marketer's point of view, there becomes a competition from a corporate side of things, because you are now looking at two formats of media and having to make choices about which one aligns with your brand strategy, and in terms of what you are building. I think when you look at it from a traditional point of view, it also allows a lot of people who may have had talent but had difficulties in accessing the industry to no longer have to wait for gatekeepers to be able to open doors for them. They are empowered to start where they are with what they have, and eventually they could end up joining a big media platform, which I think for the overall media category, it's something that is good, because it means talent that might have fallen on the wayside, it now at least has a semblance of opportunity to be able to be seen and to be able to be heard.
I think, Penson, you must come in there, with that over-opinionated voices that were cast away. So maybe talk to us about that. How has that given you or empowered you to raise, certain issues on the level and platform that you're actually on?
Talking about the rise, I think one of the main things that we need to understand is how authentic these platforms are.
Yeah.
So he spoke about gatekeepers, self-regulation within the market. In today's time, we are constantly being shifted, we're constantly being curated to be these perfect beings.
True.
And I think what is happening within this content creation or this podcasting space is that we are gravitating to a level of authenticity. If I am pro something that might be seen slightly taboo, I have now a voice to go there without being judged.
You're a Zulu man who's cultured.
I'm in that space where, unfortunately, in some of the traditional spaces, I might need to have worn a tuxedo, and present a certain personality, whereas now I can be who I am, and I can find people who can actually maybe not necessarily just agree with me all the time, but a place where I feel some sort of being at home, So again, being a person who might be opinionated or might say things that might be rough around the edges, now I've got a space where I can actually say that and feel relatively safe, you know. So if I can say something like, I'm a proud All Black fan, you know, whereas in the past you're like, no, you're South African, you must be a Springbok.
You must be patriotic.
Now
yeah.
I'm in a space where I can vocalize that, and before I realize it, there's 1,000 other people that have the same, you know, opinions as me, and I feel a lot safer to vocalize that. So that's how I've seen this space where you can be who you are without fearing that you'll get where you can get cancelled, you know, where it's there, but at least it's better than just someone switching off the TV on you.
Alton, talk to us about how, you know, the importance of those voices that were cast away on the wayside, or were just generally never given any attention, that are now garnering support through the various means of podcasts as well as broadcasting.
Okay. Thank you, Alicia, because I think when we talk about barriers of entry, right, that's one of the topics that we discuss on Something's Got to Change, because we've realized that there's so many barriers to entry when it comes to this industry.
True.
And we discuss all the different types of barriers that we see. Sometimes it's money, other times it's the fact that you don't have enough followers, but there's a lot that is happening that is actually a barrier to people entering the industry. But when you look at podcasting, you don't need to have 1 million followers. You know, you can go and start a podcast with just maybe 1,000 or even less, right? And once people catch on to the content that you're sharing, then it becomes easier for you to get in. So now that barrier that used to be there is actually now being addressed and gotten rid of by this podcasting. And also now it's more unfiltered when you look at podcasts, you know, like Openson was saying, that you can talk about anything without being restricted and being told, oh, maybe this is a little bit too much, because there's always an audience for something. Whatever you're going to be talking about, trust and believe there's someone that's going to sit down and watch and then tell other people, and the next thing you're having 1 million views, you know. So and that's the thing. But I also realized that when it comes to, you know, the podcast, I like the fact that we're now also going into the visual side of podcasts, where we start seeing the people and you actually putting the face to the name, right? And then you start relating to those people, because now you can see how they express themselves. You know, you can see how they react, and then you're like, oh, I actually like that person, and then they become more relatable. It's not just the voice, but you're actually relating to the entire human being that is on set and that you're watching and listening to. So yeah, I think when it comes to podcasting, definitely addressing those barriers to entry within the media industry. I can give an example about myself. You know, I come from corporates. Every day I wake up and do numbers.
Most of you come from
you know, but for me, because, you know, when people hear, oh, you studied actuarial science, like, oh, you're a nerd, you know, I don't see you on TV, I don't see you doing this. But then because of podcasting, I was able to get into the industry, and now people actually watch and listen to what I have to share, you know. So I think that's has been, we're making strides when it comes to breaking those barriers.
But just to add, sorry, yes, I am a nerd, but there's millions of other nerds that can relate to this nerd. So it doesn't just have to be this personality or this look or this face or this. It can be people like me in the similar space, and that's where I grow. And even if I've got 50, just imagine a room full of 50 people that are listening to what you say. It's huge, you know. So that's what I love about it.
Leroy, talk to us about, you know, what measures then, as well as strategies, can be implemented in order to address the concerns surrounding, of course, the potential misuse of the podcasting platforms by individuals that are promoting divisive ideologies as well as hate speech.
You know, it's almost counterintuitive what I'm going to say, because you don't want to regulate, and by definition this area is meant to be unregulated, right? But I think it's a responsibility. You know, the rise of social media law in the last while has been quite interesting, because you know, social media and technology just grows exponentially every year, but the law is very slow to change. You know, it needs us to, you know, either change legislation by going through the whole legislative process.
Long process,
long process. Or we have to go to court, which in itself is very expensive. And I'm almost at you know, odds to say that we need to find some regulatory body. But for me, it's the understanding that in your podcasting, that there has to be some sort of responsibility. And that responsibility means that even if you are a nerd who wants to talk about something that's not necessarily, you know, popular, we can't allow certain things. And I think we all can agree, things like pedophilia, you know, child grooming, you know, sex exploitation, you know, transphobia, homophobia. xenophobia, those isms, we know all about them. I think there has to be some sort of a monitoring that you need to dial into as a podcast that allows you to have access, just as you do with any other form of media. Journalists have to be part of an organization that allows them to be vetted and be seen as reasonable. And it goes back to your point, Elton, about how you can speak and say whatever you want, but there has to be some research available. So we need some way to almost monitor that. And for me, the self-regulation, Penson, of the industry is that people are now being able to call you out and say, that's not true. That's not how things happen, especially with what's happening in Palestine and the Gaza Strip. You're starting to see the competing ideologies, but you see people coming through and saying, but this is the facts that we have.
Does it not then take away from the actual aspect or the original idea behind what podcasting is then, Leroy, when you start having that red tape? Because you no longer Penson, the Zulu guy who can say whatever he wants to say whenever he wants. You are now having to curtail yourself to certain isms, as you've just alluded.
Well, as in the democracy that we have in South Africa, right? You're allowed to say whatever you want about anything that you want, but where your rights to say what you want end is where my rights to be protected against you begin. So if we have that understanding that you can say whatever you want, but you also have to just make sure that you're not offending me in these particular ways.
You cannot promote tribalism.
You can't, because there's ways where Penson can be pro-Zulu and not be anti-Tsonga,
anti-gay.
So you can do what you need to do, and I think
strike a fine balance between.
A fine balance, and that's why I think the issue here, and this is going to sound very, very controversial, but I also think that we need to have some sort of license to be able to share opinions that advance the conversation. I think the whole point about podcasting is that apart from the low access to barriers to access, apart from the low resources that are required and the freedom of the voice, is also being able to have the ordinary man on the street say things that are important. For instance, for someone who uses public transport on a daily basis, right? What are the issues that you're going through? For a woman who works in a workplace, what are you going through? For a disabled person in a workplace, what do you go through? As a gamer in South Africa, are you finding other gamers who are able to play with you? Do we need an infrastructural change for us to have better Wi-Fi or whatever, to grow whatever? It's more about moving the conversation forward, as opposed to traditional media where I go back to the point where we have shareholders and shareholders dictate what we can say. If I'm a beverage brand who owns a big shareholding in this industry, I'm not going to have you telling me about the bad sugar content that we have in our drinks that is potentially killing the community because you're affecting my sales now. So I need us to have, when podcasters go there, they need to understand who they're talking to and what the end game is. And for me, if we have that baseline of just saying these are things you can speak about, you can speak about anything, but just make sure that where your rights to say whatever you want end is where mine begin to be protected. So as we do in this democracy of ours, you can say whatever you want, but you need to remember, Wuti, you're not talking in a vacuum.
Very, very interesting indeed. Let's go back to our panelists on, of course, on Teams. Thabang, let's go to you there. What do you think then in relation to, of course, regulation, this conversation around regulation, what do you think should be at the top of consideration, particularly when we talk about responsibilities of the content creators as well as the podcasters and hosts themselves?
Look, I think podcasts are not unique when you look at systemically how things develop, right? Even if you look at, let's talk about business and brands, right? In a township, a spaza has a place to play, but it's informal, right? So what that means is that if I'm faced with the choice of buying from something that's formalized and unformalized, it means there are different restrictions that I'm exposed to. So for example, maybe the way that a spaza deals with customer service on the wanting side, because it's not a very big business. It's not a business that's highly regulated, right? But you still have space for big chains where for them, just by the sheer size and the responsibility they have on society, we understand why they have to be regulated. I think because podcasts are still in their infancy, of course, I do expect that the law, in some shape or form, there will start being a creep in of how to actually just guide it, even if it's not totally regulated, which is, I think, the right thing to do. Because the right thing to do is that once something becomes so big and so influential, we have to balance priorities between what is problematic versus what is giving people free speech and reign to do whatever they do. So I think, like any other industry, we will start seeing regulation that comes through. And when you start having that happening, some of the problematic platforms and podcasts will start following because they cannot pass the stress test that we as a society have agreed is the right thing to do.
And Lebo, I mean, maybe also just weigh in there. What are your views around the narrative of regulation, and who is it incumbent upon? Is it the person who is the podcaster? Is it the person who is consuming that content? Because then I suppose we're trying to strike a balance here between being censored and also being given, you know, the platform to speak how we feel. Lebu, you are muted again. Please unmute.
Goodness. But I think the conversation about regulation is very complex because it depends on which perspective you're speaking about it from. I started podcasting before podcasting was popular. I was the first African female on the iTunes Top 100 charts, and I was monetizing from my third podcast that I recorded on my phone. Even though I don't have the numbers that the most popular podcasters in 2024 have, I've got really good relationships with brands that work with me because they see me as a reliable podcast to be on. They're aware by how I articulate myself and the ideas that I choose to express, that I'm somebody who has the agency to regulate themselves, somebody who has the agency to see if what they're saying is offensive to other people, etc. Right? But not everybody has that agency. Not everybody is a marketer who understands how to sell media. So a lot of people will chase numbers. They'll say, I need so many numbers to get brands to work with me, and therefore I will do anything I can in order to get the brands to work with me. And I think where we're not speaking a lot is about how brands play a role in validating the toxic things that people do to get numbers. Because brands will literally pay the platforms that are using these funny tactics to grow. And from my perspective, if I worked in a brand, I wouldn't want to associate with a platform that will do anything just to get numbers. So I think that it's important that when we're talking about regulation, we're also speaking about who's incentivizing the way that things are being done. Because we know that toxic content and content that's unhealthy for people gets a lot of clickbait on Twitter and on other social media platforms. And that's where brands go because they don't educate themselves about what podcasting is. And they say, oh, this person is trending, therefore their podcast must be something. We go to YouTube, we see their numbers. Oh, wow, this is great. But are you checking what kind of content that they share? Are you checking how they speak? Do you understand the culture of the podcast? Who is the consumer watching this? Is this something your brand can align to? You know, I don't think brands are doing enough of that. So they're validating the fact that people will use certain tactics in order to grow. And I just also want to add that in this conversation, we've been speaking about a certain kind of podcasting, you know, where maybe, let's say, especially men will come up and speak their truth and speak whatever they see in society. But there's so many different kinds of podcasts out there. There are podcasts like mine where we just share educational value. Like I just teach people how to market. There are other podcasts where people will just teach you about faith, and they're not even trying to be controversial. And they've got a large customer base and they've got a large audience. And I think we're focusing too much on the overly controversial podcasts where people do just grab a mic and speak, but they don't know why they're doing it. They just want to be popular because they see somebody else doing it and they're popular.
And this is actually the discussion that I want us to have after the break, as well as the monetary side and the profitability side, Leroy, when we come back. This is Media and Society. Do stay with us. We're going to take a quick ad break.
The 2024 State of the Nation address is set against the backdrop of a historic year as the country celebrates 30 years of democracy. However, amid the country's myriad of challenges,
load shedding, unemployment, poverty and rising cost of living, crime and corruption,
all eyes will be fixed on President Cyril Ramaphosa as he delivers his administration's last State of the Nation address at the Cape Town City Hall. Join SABC News live on the 8th of February for in-depth coverage of the opening of Parliament. SABC News. Independent, impartial.
On Network, we simplify technology for you. To stay in the know with what's happening in the digital and technology world, catch Network at 8 p.m. on Saturday.
Welcome back to Media and Society. Now we are at the tail end of our discussion on the meteoric rise of the medium of podcasting. Still with us is Leroy Mark, who is a radio and TV personality, entrepreneur, as well as an attorney. Thabang Sekaja, co-host and producer of the Dojo podcast, and Liberline digital and new media marketer and host of the Liberline show, and Elton, the Black Elton, who is the host of Something's Gotta Change, as well as Mr. Penson Mlojo. Well, he needs no introduction. So, gentlemen, look, let's talk about that. I think at the back of that, Penson, let's talk about some of the popular narratives that Lebu was referring to, that are actually the ones that are the biggest podcasts in the country. Why do you think people pay attention to slur or type of conversations that we would call boys over a bride type of conversation? What do you think constitutes that to be, consumable content?
I think I have something controversial.
We would expect that.
We love to control the narrative.
Yeah.
Podcast, to me, to a large point, even content creation is a mirror to society. So if it is boys over bride, if that is what's getting clicks and views, what is that telling us about our society? So when we go and in certain educated, learned spaces, woke spaces, we will talk down on an Andrew Tate. The question is, why is it that he has such a huge following? Why is it that you have millions of young men that are actually gravitating to that?
Because you're talking about gossip and who's in a relationship with whoever. That's more consumable.
The question is why? The question is, why is it that as a society we gravitate towards gossip, we gravitate towards whatever these topics may be? Let us take a step back and let's look at ourselves and say, okay, Sharp, there's clearly a need for this. There's people who are not being heard. The podcast space is not just for people, let's say Upensin, who is talking about education. This is how a child applies to get into university. That's great. That's amazing. But it's also a space for people who can actually, like the rap culture in the 80s and 90s, who can be raw and authentic, who can say, I actually just want to be here to talk about let's not control those people's or take away their rights to just also want to trend and to be famous. They have the same right, as much as I want to educate the masses on how to do things according to what I deem is important, they have the right to also want to spaces where they can talk about gossip, twerking, krama, and I need to respect that. And if those are the things that are trending, and if that is where the views are going, the question again is society. Let's take a step back and ask ourselves, why is it that is more valued than what I have to share, which is educational and is meant to grow society?
What do you think of that, Elton?
Okay, so here's my thing. I'm gonna have to agree with Penson. Don't come for me. Don't come for me.
After the show, we're coming for you.
Please, guys, this one time in history. Okay, so here's my take, right? Just to add on to what he's saying. As a country, we love drama. We love a little bit of,
gossip here and there.
And we see it with the reality shows that are currently on television. People love something that is going to shock you. It must have a shock factor. It must trend. And unfortunately, when you want something to trend, there needs to be something that is controversial in order for it to trend, right? So that's what people in the podcasting industry are also doing now, where they're saying, if I just say this, it's going to shock people. And then people are gonna, come. So it's gonna cause traffic there. But then again, there's also a responsibility to say, okay, but where does it end? Do we have boundaries to say, okay, we can't go over this line. And I feel like in most cases, people tend to go over the line and then they find themselves cancelled. There's nothing wrong with controversy, right? But I think it goes back to understanding that your opinion comes with your responsibility. Every right has a responsibility. Those are the basics that we taught. Leroy knows more about the law, so he'll expand. But those are the basics we are taught in school.
We're almost out of time. Look, I just want Leroy to quickly touch on the monetary side and aspect. And I suppose it's a big contributor to why people will go the gossip route or the over-consumable type of content, Leroy.
I think, as we've said, I think the consensus is that the more controversial, the more eyes, and the more eyes, the more brands will want to engage. Even the way YouTube works, the more views you get, the more money you get. But this is the issue that I have with how we've decided to monetize the platforms, that there should be other ways that you're able to, as a model, get your money coming in without having to pander to having a popular conversation that will shock and get people to say, listen, Alicia, you must watch this podcast because it's so controversial. The gossip is always great, because we get people who go, oh, I want to hear more about this. Even what X has done, X has, the more people, and because of what's happened on X, people are saying the most outrageous things. And they're willing to take the risk of being sued or cancelled because they know a check is coming in the mail. So maybe what we need to do is, from a fiscal point of view, find a way to monetize these platforms in a different way so that you're not trying to get as many eyeballs on. I love what Lebu was saying about how she monetized her platform, episode 3 in, by talking wholesomely about something that people want to know about. And maybe it should not be the number of views, but also the quality and content of the podcast that is monetized. If it has a value to add into the discourse, or, as you do a doctoral thesis or whatever, if you're able to add to the discourse, then maybe we should pay you a bit more for that.
All right. Unfortunately, we are out of time on our discussion. Gentlemen, thank you so much for this progressive discussion. Thabang as well as Lebu, thank you so much also for joining us. Thank you at home for watching our show, Media and Society. We hope that you will join us again, same time and place next week. For myself and the rest of the team, have yourself a good day and stay blessed. Bye.